Hey, Nathan here. Welcome back to another Unity video. And in this video, we are going to discuss the very basics of animations. Sprite animations, to be exact. So, last video, we discussed how to get collision working, and this is the exact same sample that I released in the last video. I just moved my enemy around and scaled him up a bit so he's an easier target to hit when I need to demonstrate something. Other than that, this is exactly the same. Okay, so what I want to do is I wanted to talk about the very basics of animation and to do a very basic state transition from one animation state to the next. We'll get into more complex stuff later on. This is just to get us the basics going for when we discuss the actual space shooter game. Okay, so before we begin, make sure you go to Window here and make sure you have Animation and Animator open, and I left the animation up top here. I put it up top, and the animator is down here. Alright, so let's go to project and game here. So I'm going to animate the player. When it spawns, when the game first launches, I want to have an animation of the kind of the player's spaceship opening its wings up, for example. And then it goes from a white tint to the blue-green that you see here. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag in my Sprite Sheet animation image file. You can find the link for this in the description below. And I'm going to drag it into my assets section. So here it is. Player paper animated. So it's the Sprite Sheet of it fully closed, and it's grayscale, white looking, and then the wings open up and it actually brings in the color. Alright, so if I select this, you'll see it's set to a texture mode of Sprite 2D and UI. We want to set this from single to multiple. This is what you use when it's a Sprite Sheet. Alright, so now let's go into the Sprite Editor, and let's apply that here. Okay, what we need to do is we need to slice this up into frames, and if the Sprite Sheet is not built around an easy way to create a grid, you will have to work around that. So in this case, I created this Sprite Sheet in a way where you can easily slice it up by math, or even Unity does things a little bit better. We are going to slice it up by providing the cell count. Okay, so columns and rows. We're going to provide the number of columns and rows, and it will automatically slice it up into each individual frames. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns and 2 rows. And if we do that, and then we hit slice, now each one of these is a frame. And it was smart enough to not, this is completely transparent, it was smart enough not to make that a frame. So now there's only 10 frames, so let's close this. Let's apply that. Let's hit the arrow here, and now we have 10 separate sprites. Okay. So that's the first step. We sliced our Sprite Sheet, one image file, into 10 multiple files. Now we need to actually create the animation. So let's click the player object here in the hierarchy. Let's go to Add Component, and let's search for Animation. Or, I'm sorry, we want Animator. Okay, so the animator needs a controller, and it needs an avatar. I'm not going to use an avatar. It's using the sprite renderer, and it's going to use that. So let's go into our Assets section here, and let's right-click and go to Create Animation Controller. So let's call this Player Animation. So that's the animator controller. Now if we double click that, this is our animator controller. Okay. Now an animator controller can have multiple states and multiple animations attached to it. then it can go from state to state. For example, we're going to go from spawn here to idle. Now, idle is not going to do anything. This is the idle animation. It's just a static image. So the idle animation is just going to be one image, and it's just going to loop in that state. So let's right-click our assets section here, and let's go to create animation. Animation, we're going to call this player spawn. Now let's do the same thing, right-click, create animation, player idle. Okay. So let's go to animator, and let's create a new state, an empty state. Now, when you first create a state, it is orange. That means it's the default. The object enters, and then it goes to the state you provide here. And then you can see the transition here. You can't really see it because that's the initial state. You can't modify it. We'll get into this arrow here when we go into the idle state. So this is a new state. I'm going to call this spawn. So the game object enters existence and it goes to the spawn state. It's not, we'll get into that later on. Okay, so the spawn state needs a motion. So the motion is an animation. It's going to be player spawn. So let's do that. So now it's linked to player spawn. Okay, the first thing we need to do is link our animator controller into our player object. So now it's going to have player animation. Okay? So if we go to player here, we have a drop down here. Player spawn. Make sure you're looking at the animation. Now, when I selected player spawn, it immediately turned these to red, and it's assuming I'm just going to record an animation. I'm going to turn that off. So just click that record icon there. Alright, so I have player spawn here. I've selected the player. I'm looking at player spawn. So I'm going to drag all these images in here. So now that's the animation. And then I can scroll using my mouse and I can see each individual frame. Okay. Now player, animator, and then spawn. Okay. So this is the player spawn. And that's the animation. Now what I did there was I double clicked this, and then I was able to get this player spawn preview here. If you do this, you can drag a object in here, and then you can use your right mouse button, hold that down and rotate it, and we can play it. And now that's the animation. It's a little bit fast, so I'm going to turn that down. Let's make it maybe 15. Let's see if that looks any better. Yeah, that looks good. Okay. So again, I'm going to double click this and make sure it's not looping. Alright, so that is our spawn. Now if we hit play here, you can see it's spawning. Now if I hit play again, you'll see it spawn. It'll do that animation. Now I'm going to create another state called idle. Now this is only going to be a single frame, but it'll give me the ability to create a multiple frame idle animation later on if I choose to. And this will also give me a chance to discuss the transition between states. Okay, so I'm going to right click and create a state empty. Alright, now this one is gray. It is not the initial orange. It's not the initial animation. So I'm going to call this idle, and it's going to link to the player idle animation. Now, to get from spawn to idle, you right click spawn and make transition, and then it's linked to your mouse, so then I just click idle. Now this will do some clever things in the background, like easy ease out and in transitions on the two states, so it does fade out and fade in. that kind of thing. We can see what it looks like if we click this. So it does a fade effect, and we don't want that to happen. What we can do is click this drop downs for settings. The exit time is going to be 1. That's 100%. Right after spawn is done, we want idle. We don't want it to be 0.5, which is halfway through. We don't want it to be 0, which is at the beginning. We want it 1 at the end. So the exit time is between 0 and 1. Leave fixed duration is fine. We don't want it to have transition duration, so I'll just set that to 0. And offset 0. Okay, so now it got rid of that little transition effect. Okay, so now it's going to sit at idle, and we want that to loop. It's just going to be a single frame, but if in the future I want to have idle animation, I want that to loop. Just keep on looping. Now, I have player here. Drop down, player idle. It has nothing in here yet, so I'm going to go to project. I'm going to drag the player paper sprite in here. And I'm just going to set that up as 1 frame a second here. Alright, take that off so it's not recording. Okay. So now, let's take a look at the animator and the game here. So now we can see how the actual animation is. So it's no longer on spawn, and you can see the progress bar and idle is just looping. I can move this around, and let's actually, I'm going to set the spawn animation, player spawn to, let's say, 2. Take off record. So you can see I can actually move my object as it's animating. We didn't have to do anything in the background. We can move our object while it's animating, which is very nice. I'm going to set that back to 15. Now I'm going to hit play. And there we go. Okay, so that's the very basics of animation. We'll get into more complex things later on. For example, if I click the transition here, you can set conditions. So, for example, when a bullet collides with an enemy, we want the bullet animation to be destroy. So that's going to be a condition. When the bullet needs to be destroyed, it will go into the destroy animation. And then we'll link that to exit. Okay. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got a good understanding on the basics of animation. So, a quick recap. We loaded up our single image file for multiple frames called a Sprite Sheet. Then we set that up in Unity's inspector to be multiple, and we went to the sprite editor and told it to slice it by the number of columns and rows. If you use a royalty-free Sprite Sheet, just make sure that it's limited to a single animation. For example, there's some sprite sheets out there that are player, for example, or spaceship in this case, where all animations are on one sprite sheet. And then, you know, the top left 20 images are when it's spawning, and the top right 20 images are when it's idle. And then the middle portion of the sprite sheet is when it's attacking, that kind of thing. So they might do multiple animations in a single sprite sheet. So just look up the instructions or whatever the sprite sheet animation needs to be. If it's limited to a single action, for example, spaceship spawn in this case, you should be able to just slice it up by columns and rows, unless it was not set up that way either. So just be aware of that whenever you're bringing in a sprite sheet. All the sprite sheets I create and will create are going to be set up where it'll have a single set of, each frame is going to be the same width and height. So all you can do is just easily say, oh, 6 columns, 2 rows. Then boom, slice it that way. Once you slice it and apply it, you'll have frames 0 to 10 accessible, And then we need to create an animation controller, and we need to add the component animator, animator controller. And then we need to add the component animator and link the player animation animator controller. It's very confusing. Animator, animation, I constantly flip those around. So the animator, we create that component. Then we link the player animation animator controller into that. And then we go into this player animation animator, and then we set a spawn state. Now that's the initial state, so it has a transition from entry, and it's a little bit of an orange color. Speed is 1. If I double click that, I don't set it to loop. I only want it to spawn once. If I single click it, make sure you link it to a player spawn animation object. So if we go back to project here, you can right click, create animation. So you create the idle and spawn animations. And then you go into the animator, create the states, and link it to the animation object by doing that. Once you do that, you can select the player, the spawn, and then the drop down here you have accessible based on the states you have here. So player spawn here. Then once that's loaded and you turn off recording mode, you can go back to project. It's still up here. Player spawn is still selected here. You can expand the sprite sheet, select all of them, and then drag it up to this window here. And it will automatically make each one of those a keyframe. And then you set the samples to how fast you want it to be per second. And then you're good to go. If you want to see what it looks like, double click it and then drag the object you want to test it with into this window here. And then you can hit play here so you can see what it looks like. So idle, play that. It's just a single image. And that one I do want to have looped, so that's why I checked that. We also discussed the transition between two states from spawn to idle. So when is that going to be transitioned automatically? This is going to loop once, and then it will automatically transition to idle. We adjust it so there is no transition duration or anything like that. It's going to transition at the end of the spawn animation. It's going to have a 0 duration and 0 offset. So it's going to be spawn, then idle. It's not going to overlap at all. So you click this drop down here to get those settings to modify those. Okay, so that's pretty much it. And then if you hit play with the animator window visible, you can see what state it is in whenever you're playing. Okay, so that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. There's going to be a few weeks break, and then we're going to discuss a space shooter where we're going to discuss more advanced topics. More advanced animations, more advanced collision, more advanced everything. It's going to be a fully complete game. It might take 12 tutorials, or it might take 20 tutorials. I don't know yet. So we'll just dive right into it and see how it goes. I'm probably going to make a little bit more sprites, but it's probably going to be on the same look and feel as this. I might create a static space background. I'm not sure yet. Or we'll dive into creating a particle system where we can create stars on the fly. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for the Space Shooter game series. This series will continue to go on. If there's a topic that needs to be addressed, I will create a new episode for just discussing that topic. But other than that, this series will be on hold. So, I hope you enjoyed this series. I hope it got you a fresh jump start on Unity2D. And I hope you're liking it as much as I do. There's a lot of nice things about it. I didn't have to write code for slicing up a sprite sheet, and I didn't have to write code to move from one texture 2D to the next. So if you don't have the time or you don't really care about writing your custom code, you can just use Unity, and I find that a lot nicer. And when you do need to write code, for example, if we look at our player script, I did need to write code by keyboard input. So when you do write code, it is in C#. So it has all the benefits, and it's just, I find it much better. It's not a completely blank slate. Now, if you prefer writing your own engine and writing your own code, monogame or C++ or DirectX or that kind of thing is more up your alley. But if you prefer having this do 90% of the work and you only write code when you need to perform some action by keyboard input or whatever, this will be much nicer. And can you imagine how long it would take to create an animator and animations and all this in monogame from scratch? Zero code, no third-party code, just manually doing it yourself. That would probably take 5 or 6 videos. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.